I'm Jeri Smith. I head up Communicus. We do in-market advertising research to help advertisers understand how to use their advertising to build their brands, and if they have a campaign in market, how to make it work harder to build their brands. So Daniel Kahneman's book and the thinking fast, thinking slow concepts really struck a chord with me in terms of helping me think about how our research really uncovers the way advertising builds brands. And so it helped me to think about our methods and how to make them better and how to make them work even harder and how to explain how advertising was working to our clients. And shortly after I read the book that changed my life, I met my partner in crime, Trevor, who you will be hearing from shortly. And Trevor has a long history with Daniel Kahneman's theories and dual processing and thinking fast and thinking slow and system 1 and system 2. So we've had a lot of fun in the last few years really further developing and refining the way we think about how advertising builds brands and how brands are built within people's system 1 brains. So I wanted to start with just a little quick review of what we're talking about when we talk about system 1, and then how it relates to advertising and how advertising builds brands. And then we're going to talk about some measurement best practices, and some of what we've got to say is a little bit controversial because there's a lot of thinking out there about how you can and can't measure system 1, and we've got some ideas about that some of you might disagree with, and if so, we'd love to hear to get a debate going on that. So what is system 1? System 1 is the part of our brains that operates from a gut level, little to no conscious thought. It includes learned behaviors, so a lot of what happens in system 1 is based on things that we've learned how to do in the past. It fills gaps and makes assumptions. It doesn't think about A to B to C. It just puts it all together. And emotions reside in system 1, and we'll talk a little bit more about emotions as we get into how advertising works. So system 1 is in play when this woman is walking down the street, probably not particularly thinking about where she is at that moment in time, other than the fact that hopefully the light is red, and so she's not going to get hit by a car. We like system 1 because it conserves energy. We don't have to think really hard. My version of this woman is driving home from work. I know where I'm going. I don't have to think about what that next turn is going to be. In fact, last week, I was driving home from work and I meant to stop at the grocery store. And pretty soon I'm turning up my street. It's like, oh, geez, I didn't stop at the grocery store because I was in system 1 in terms of my driving. I was thinking about other things. So system 1 allows me to get things done without having to put conscious thought into it. In contrast, system 2 requires much more energy and thought. When there's a new problem to solve, when I have to think about this, then what should I do in this situation, figures out how to make deliberate choices. So if I'm driving home from work and suddenly I encounter a lot of traffic where there isn't usually traffic, I'm going to say, wait, I wonder if there's an accident up ahead. I know there's a back route this way. Maybe I'll take that. So now my system 2 has kicked in. I'm no longer thinking about that research presentation I have to give tomorrow, which is what I was thinking about when I missed that stop at the grocery store. So my system 1 has come into play here. So it steps in when it's needed. It's not an either-or situation. It comes in and helps out when it's needed. So if we think about system 1 and system 2 that way, that brings us to brand choice. So system 1, because it's learned, because it's automatic, because it's intuitive, it includes a lot of biases, right? So my husband and I are thinking about buying a truck. I would never consider a Toyota truck, right? Detroit makes trucks. So already I've got these biases in place that once I get to my actual consideration and decision making, I've narrowed the list. And I've narrowed the list based on my system 1 biases, but then because it's a truck and it's going to cost a lot of money and I'm going to have it for a long time, Then I start to get rational and think about all the reasons why, but it's overlaid with these system one biases. So even in things like considered purchases, even in life decisions that are really important, like where to go to college, when to move to a new city, all of these system one biases play a tremendous role. So it's really important to understand how System 1 is operating, in particular when it comes to brands and the purchase decision processes. So let's talk about that. How can advertising be optimized to drive System 1 based results? How many of you know what brand of toothpaste you have in your cabinet at home? And how many of you have Colgate? And how many of you have Crest? Can you tell me why? Okay. Anybody else? Oh, good rational decision making. Thank you. Okay. And there you go. So when I go to the store, I have toothpaste on my list or in my head that I need to buy it, and I walk down the aisle and I just grab Crest because it's what I buy. So System 1 has really come into play here. I don't make all of these purchase decisions as I go down the aisle. It's not like, I wonder if I should buy Campbell's or if I should buy Progresso. It's just like, that's what I buy. So how can advertising drive that decision making? There's a lot of different steps along the way in which System 1 plays a role. System 1 is generally in charge of what ads to notice and remember. You make these snap decisions, these 5,000 potential ad exposures you get a day. System 1 is helping you decide which ones you're going to pay attention to and which ones you're not. Is there something that strikes a chord? What specific aspects of the ad do you actually take in and remember and stick into your long-term memory? That's System 1 in charge most of the time. And then after the fact, after the ads get processed and retained and mixed up in your System 1 memory, if all works as planned, you're going to go to the store and grab that brand off the shelf. So purchase decisions are made in System 1. So let's spend a little bit of time on that process. As I said, System 1 decides which ads get attention, and emotion is one piece of this, but another is how the ad resonates with System 1 beliefs. An ad does not have to be emotional to draw us in and to bring us into our System 1 mode. It just has to maybe be familiar, it has to strike a chord, it has to have something that we feel on some level is going to provide us a reward for watching that ad. We know that brands that use familiar, distinctive brand assets have a tremendous leg up over brands that don't. So put the Pillsbury Doughboy in an ad, and I can guarantee you a lot more people are going to pay attention to that ad because it's a familiar, lovable character. So this is tapping into how they feel in System 1. So there's a lot of ways that we can draw people into ads besides creating ads that are purely emotional per se. However, if the ad experience is not connected to the brand, it will never be attached to the brand space in System 1. If you imagine in the brain, there's a little space in my head called Crest toothpaste, and if I see a toothpaste ad, but it's designed to be an engaging, entertaining Super Bowl ad and nobody knows it's for Crest, it's not going to make it into that space. So the brand has got to be a piece of what happens during that experience if it's ever going to make it into that System 1 brain space that I call toothpaste or Colgate or Crest. Brand outcomes are produced by campaigns, not by individual ads. It all adds up together and gets stirred up in the brain. It's not like one ad is going to suddenly change how I feel on a gut level about a brand. And brand outcomes are also a result of all of the other things that are happening around the brand. So if you've got a brand story that people know and believe in their System 1, and then you introduce a new advertising campaign that's talking about the brand in a completely disconnected way, it's going to be really hard to get that brand, that ad experience to resonate within that brand space in the brain. So it has to be consistent. So the desired end state for advertising, if you really want to harness System 1 thinking and how the System 1 brain works, is to produce behavior that is driven at least in part by System 1 based brand connections. So solidify the connection in the brain between the brand and all of these positive things. And I'm going to walk down the aisle and I'm going to pick this brand, and I'm not even going to be able to tell you why I did. So that's all well and good. But we're a research company, and we measure advertising's impact in market in terms of brand building. So how the heck do you measure this, right? Because System 1 is that intuitive, gut level, hard to explain reason why people do things that they can't tell you because it's so automatic. So how can we possibly measure it? And Trevor is going to tell you how we solve that puzzle.
Sure. Thanks, Jeri. All right, thanks everybody for having me here today. I was really excited to be able to talk on this topic. It's something I've been studying for about 14 years now. My first paper I went back and looked that I ever published on this topic in previous life as an academic was 12 years ago now, which is hard for me to believe. So I'm really excited to be able to talk to you about what we have in terms of how to align your survey research so that it is more consistent with System 1 best practices and what we know about how System 1 works and how to get at responses that are both going to be driven by System 1 and correlate with other System 1 measurements that you might be looking at in your research suite. So where I want to start is actually thinking about what people are good at and what people are bad at when they make judgments, when they're taking surveys, okay? And one thing that you can often come away with feeling when you read the literature on System 1 and System 2 is that people actually have no access to their mental state at all, right? You can often come away feeling like people are just driven by emotions or by gut intuitions, and that stuff definitely exists, but it is not the case that we have no access or understanding of our own mental state, okay? So I want to make that as a first point. Consumers do have trouble, though, with a really important aspect of their own mental life, and it's one that we as marketing researchers and advertising researchers often want to know about. People are really bad, all of us are really bad at understanding causal links between what we have experienced in the world and what we are currently doing, what we're going to do in the future. But what we can do is tell you what we're thinking and feeling right now. And that access to information is actually pretty strong. And there's a good amount of research that tells us that we can trust our in-the-moment decisions. What we can't do is draw causal links very well. We're very bad at interpreting those causal links. Okay? So why, whether how they feel has changed, why they did what they did. These are sorts of things people are going to have particular problems with. But people believe they're quite good at these things, right? So if you ask questions like these in a survey, people will give you answers all day long. So we have to be really cognizant about this problem with human self-report, right? People are bad at self-reporting causation, okay? Particularly because they're going to try. They're going to be confident that they can do it. So what in the world do we do, right? We're all researchers here, many of us. What do we actually do to get past this question? And I'm going to give you just some basic information from some research we've been conducting over the last couple years. So the first thing is really easy. Focus on those in-the-moment judgments, right? When you talk to your consumers, ask them how they feel about things. Ask them whether a particular ad or stimulus makes them feel right now, in the moment. And ask them how well they like something. People can report that information, and it correlates with System 1 responses, and it is accurate in the moment with a pretty high degree of reliability. This is sort of a no-brainer. I'm sure we all think about this on a day-to-day basis, but ask your questions in easy language that's consumer-friendly, right? So we've got to improve how we actually elicit judgments. Don't use a sentence when a phrase will do. Don't use a phrase when a word will do. This is particularly important if you're trying to get your survey research down to the point where it can actually elicit responses that are consistent with System 1, okay? So if you're asking really wordy, full sentence type questions, it's going to take so long just to process what's being asked of an individual that there's no opportunity to get at a more heavily system one response. It's not going to happen because you're going to give people long enough to start rationalizing, and that whole process that you hear about, if you're familiar with dual process models of post hoc rationalization, is going to occur. It's going to become part of the process the longer and the more involved the question that you're asking is, okay? So keep yourself focused on short, simple questions, whether you're asking about brands or whether you're asking about advertising diagnostics. Keep it focused in. The next thing we can focus on is how we're actually asking people to respond to those shorter, simpler questions that we're asking them. Right? So here we've done a good amount of research over the last couple years looking both at how people answer questions about brands. So if you want to get at how people are feeling about a particular brand, if you want to know whether people view Coke as a product that's a good value or something that's high quality, question like that, what we have found is that a focus on binary, and particularly if you can add along a visual component to it, like a thumbs up or a happy or a sad face, if you're looking for a more valence-based judgment, gives you far better responses, particularly if you're trying to be aligned with System 1 thinking. The process, even just going from 2 to 3 levels, really shifts you out of an ability to make an intuitive, quick, fast judgment into something that feels like a much more rational judgment for our respondents that we've had in our studies. So we always recommend for clients who are trying to be System 1 aligned, moving towards a binary judgment unless it really does not fit the sort of question or judgment that you're asking. And that tends to be when you're going to move away from a System 1 type of question. Okay.
So are you saying it's only thumbs up, thumbs down, it's not the other thumb down?
Yeah, that's right. And is the laser, there we go. Yeah, so what we want to use is the thumbs up, thumbs down, as opposed to the Likert scale or the slider scale. What we found is that we get increased engagement from respondents. They're able to answer these questions better. They can answer them faster. And we get increased discrimination, ironically. So we actually get more variance both between, say, a set of brand statements within a respondent, and we also see increased variance between those statements between respondents. Yeah?
How do you know that you haven't forced the respondent into, well, I'm giving it a thumbs down, but it's just this one thing? Where do you get the...
Sure. So I think for us, the best evidence is that what we're really looking for is how these things correlate with and drive different KPIs that our clients might have. And what we see is when we move over to questions like this, we see much stronger correlations, much tighter relationships between variables, which I think is...
This was really counterintuitive to me. When Trevor first started talking about this, I'm like, no, we need better sensitivity in our data. You know, we need to see if people move a little. We can't just say yes, no, thumbs up, thumbs down, because we won't be able to really read the more subtle effects of advertising. And it was really very, very surprising to me when Trevor was able to demonstrate to me that a scale like this that looks like it has a lot of sensitivity, or a scale like this that looks like it has a lot of sensitivity, that's not how consumers use them. So we get much more sensitivity in terms of variations between respondents and between attributes on a particular respondent with this kind of a scale.
Just to follow up, because I'd really like to go into that direction, because it is so much easier, with so much simpler. Is the operational thinking then that it doesn't matter if it's close to a thumbs up, it just matters that they chose the thumbs down, and forget the why. They ultimately put it in that category and move on to the next thing.
Particularly at the aggregate.
Yes, yeah.
Particularly at the aggregate, right, once you're looking at groups of individuals.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
So what are you saying that emotions are really spinal? You're saying emotions are binary, you don't like it.
I'm saying if you're, from a measurement perspective, measuring them at a binary level is going to give you better predictive capability for KPIs that you're interested in. Whether or not emotions are binary, I probably wouldn't go that far, but from a measurement perspective, yeah.
Can you use opposing adjectives?
For sure, yeah, you could do something like that, I think. We haven't studied that case in particular, actually, so I shouldn't say for sure, but I would suspect that that would be a good option to use. This is one that I think is particularly critical for aligning your data with System 1. okay? And this is elicit fast gut level responses. So we use a rapid response methodology a lot of the time. When we use a rapid response methodology, what we're talking about here is forcing people to make a response quickly. Now, calibrating exactly what quickly means is a challenging research question, and it's one that I'm not going to go into here. But you want to force a person to make a judgment within approximately 1 to 2 seconds, let's say. It's going to depend a little bit on what you're doing, but really you want to keep it in that 1 second range, okay? This gives you a couple pieces of information that I didn't expect to get when we first started using a rapid response methodology. One, it really does, I think, elicit these sort of gut reactions from people in a way that they don't get when they have time to make their decision. But it also gives you a measure of how much indecision, what percentage of people can't actually make a gut decision about whether a brand is of a good value or is high quality, right? So you can actually measure the quantity of people who just get passed over on a particular question and use that as an additional metric to understand whether your brand is actually penetrating at a system 1 level, right? So it's a really useful methodology. We think it rules out indecisiveness quite well. Again, we see increased variability when we give people a suite of speeded response questions. And we really think that it clarifies insights in a dramatic way. When we moved to a speeded response methodology, particularly for looking at advertising diagnostics, we had oftentimes struggled to see correlations between diagnostic measures when we asked them in a very rational, deliberative method and KPIs that our clients were interested in. Once we moved to a rapid response methodology, we saw dramatic increases in the correlations between those diagnostics and the outcome variables we were focused on. Yes?
When you say rapid response methodology, are you actually taking the measurement of milliseconds, how fast the person responds, or you just fast, like what exactly?
No, we force them so they will just not be able to answer the question after the interval that we put in place.
But do you ever look at the how fast? Because I've done other research online where it's actually for the milliseconds, like so they tell you that the people that responded very quickly have higher passion for something versus not.
Not in this particular methodology, we don't. Yeah. Certainly during the calibration process, but not once you've decided on a threshold. The last thing that I wanted to mention was don't overthink your emotional responses. Okay, we've gotten a lot of clients who want to know whether they should be moving to emojis or whether they should be moving to pictures. And what we've consistently found, somewhat counterintuitively to me, is that both of these actually produce less reliable and less variable emotional data sets than just asking people words. Part of this comes because people have a really hard time interpreting the same face the same way. Cross-culturally, this gets to be an even bigger problem. Whereas as long as you're within the language and you're using common language, words work. So you want to ask them quickly, do all of the same best practices we've talked about already. But words have tended to us to work better for getting at emotional processing in particular than using emojis or using pictures. So, yeah.
It's counterintuitive to the like the thumbs up, thumbs down versus like the emoji seems like the smiley face you were talking about.
Sure. So I think that's a special case, the binary piece. And the important piece there is that it's a binary choice, not that it's thumbs up, thumbs down. I would say use a just agree, disagree word response over a 5-point Likert scale that goes from a smiley face to a frowny face, for instance. So let's pull this all back together. We've talked about how people really are bad at making those sort of causal judgments, but in the moment, they actually are reliable. We've talked about some methodological things we can do to align our questioning within our surveys a little bit more closely to System 1 methodologies. But that still leaves us missing the causal piece of the story, right? How do we know how people have changed? And there's a bunch of different techniques you can use, several of which have been discussed in great talks today. But we think you want to use observational and implicit methodologies, okay? Watch how people behave, just use observational methods. Also, implicit association, visual metaphor, facial coding, and many of the neuroscience techniques that were described today are all really great candidates, particularly if you're thinking in terms of pre-testing or before you've gone into market. Well, once you've gone into market, there's another alternative that we think is perhaps the strongest implicit measurement that you can use, and that's a longitudinal approach. It's really ideal for doing implicit measurement that takes advantage of the access people do have to their in-the-moment judgments, but allows you to understand the causal story that occurs over a longer time frame. So let's imagine that we've interviewed a group of people in January, and we want to know how we're going to put in place a advertising or marketing communication in this in the interval after January. And then we're going to come back to those individuals again. And we're going to interview those same people, ask them the same questions, and identify whether or not they've been exposed to their advertising campaign. Okay? So notice what we can do here. We can stay focused on doing what people are good at doing. We can ask them in-the-moment judgments here, and we can ask them in-the-moment judgments here. We don't have to ask them in January whether they think that seeing an ad in January is going to make them go out and buy a car in June. And we don't have to ask them in June whether the ad that they saw here was the thing that led them to buy a car in the interval. Okay? We can just focus on asking them in-the-moment judgments and infer the causation. Let me get through the end of the presentation because we're running out of time.
Are these the same people?
Yeah, so you're going to measure the exact same people, get multiple measurements on them.
Change course in between.
Yeah, they really improved their quality of life. We're going to, what you'll want to do if you're particularly focused on the advertising perspective, you'll want to identify these naturally occurring groups that are going to fall out from people who were exposed to your advertising messaging and people who weren't, people who saw your TV ads or people who engage with your print. You're going to have those two groups just naturally occur, identify both of them, and then what you can do is you can infer that causation relying purely on in-the-moment judgments by looking at how the people who saw your ads changed between your pre-measurement in January and your post-measurement in June versus the people who didn't see your communication and what their judgments were in January and in June. And you can pull out the causal relationship between your advertising and the measures that you're really interested in, all while keeping within a framework that's perfectly consistent with System 1 thinking and really relies on what people are actually good at and avoids the kind of things that people are bad at.
And how do you know if they've seen the ads? Are you
Well, that's a secret sauce that I'm not going to be talking about today. So, in summary, System 1 is critically important, and you really should be thinking about integrating System 1 thinking into your survey research, into any research that you're doing. But first, it's more than just emotions. So if you're really thinking about System 1 just as emotions, you're really not thinking about it broadly enough. System 1 is really all of your intuition and gut responses that drive your automatic processing on a day-to-day basis. Emotion is certainly in the picture, but it is not the whole picture. And lastly, the measurement of it is possible even within a traditional survey format. But it requires the development of better research designs and better questioning protocols. Focus on judgments, not having people draw the causal connections for you. Use a longitudinal design when you're going to be inferring that causation. And make sure you've tuned your survey. Keep the questions simple, just keep them fast, and don't go down the red herring of using faces and emojis for emotions. And we'll open it up for questions. I think we have 1 or 2 more minutes. Yeah.
Sorry to keep asking questions, but I'm really interested. The speed thing.
Yes.
So my bride has visual perception
Yeah.
disorder. She cannot read things quickly.
Yeah.
When you're going through that, do you throw out the first couple as just filler to let people figure out the rhythm, what's going on, and then they can, do you give them a couple of red herrings there so they can catch
Give
up
them-
to what you're doing?
Yeah, we give them an opportunity to learn how the process is going to work. Yeah, we don't actually throw data away, but we do a sort of practice run. So I guess in a sense we do.
And so you give them only 2 seconds?
That really depends. That's beyond what we can talk about here. 1 to 2 seconds.
Okay, so it's not 5.
I wouldn't do 5. Yeah, we're technically out of time, so feel free to leave.
I thought it was really interesting that you said you go from sentences to phrases to words where possible. Can you give an example of a situation like that?
I can give you endless examples of surveys where we have questions that are far too long. So maybe you get from a sure. So I mean, if you take that good value, if you take that just that good value expression, right? So maybe value can be where you ultimately end up. Maybe where you started was something you got from a client partner that you're working with, which was, is a good value given the given the context of the market and blah, 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 right? Sometimes you get these sort of absurdly long questions. As soon as you start building in all of that context, all of these other pieces that people are going to think about, when you start conditionalizing what you're asking people to make a judgment about, that's the sort of thing I'm thinking of. Yes?
How come no reference to any combined methodologies with qualitative?
Well, none that we have particularly pursued here. I do think the right kind of open-end responses can be particularly compelling, and I think that some of the work on visual metaphor and things like that are pretty good at getting at implicit measurement, but they're not within the context of the research we're talking about here.
Thank you all. Enjoy your evening.
Thank you.
We'll see you back here in the morning.